Chapter 41. Mr. Wellington came into my bedroom just after daylight, dressed in his robe. I had been awake since the birds sounded almost about an hour ago, enjoying the large, comfortable bed in one of his t-shirts. He'd washed my clothes for me and set them at the foot of the bed. "Get dressed," he said. "We've got to get an early start." He walked out, and I heard him in the kitchen pouring a cup of coffee. I put on the clean clothes and went into the living room to wait. Mr. Wellington came in with his coffee in one hand and a newspaper in the other. He held the paper out to me and nodded towards the pictures in it. They were pictures of the place along the road where I'd left Kit when he was sick. "This where we need to go to get that gun?" "Yes, sir." "Let me get dressed and we'll be on our way." A half an hour later, we were in Mr. Wellington's truck and headed for the Talladega National Forest. After a few minutes, he leaned over the seat and rolled down my window. The morning was cool and humid, and the wind felt good on my face. He took a cigar out of the glove box and stuck it in his mouth. As he chewed it, I realized where that pleasant smell of the truck came from. "You've got a fancy new truck." "I'd rather have an old one." "Well, why don't you get one? You're rich." "Maybe I will." I looked over at him. He continued to stare at the road ahead. "It's a long way in there to get that gun, I said. "How old do you think I am?" he asked. Pretty old." Mr. Wellington laughed. "I think we need to teach you some tact before we put you in front of a judge. All I asked for was to go to jail." "That's because you don't know any better." I studied his face. "Pap never did like the law." "I've gathered that. All you do for a living is the law." "That's right. However, what I do is a lot different from what policemen and constables do. They enforce the law. I just explain it to people." "Well, how about explaining it to me? How come Pap hated it?" "Well, the law is just the rules that most people in the country decide that everyone has to obey. There are people like your father who don't like being told what to do. They don't like to obey the rules." "Well, how come?" "I'm not sure. People have a lot of different reasons." "How do you learn what the rules are? I haven't meant to do anything wrong ever since Pap died, and people are all chasing me all over." Mr. Wellington chuckled. "I guess that's why you're so famous, Moon. Everybody wants to hear about a child who can be raised out there in the forest with no sense of the rules." We pulled over and got 6 sausage biscuits at a drive-through restaurant. I ate 2 of them before I spoke another word. "Save some for lunch," Mr. Wellington said. He reached over and took the biscuit wrappers from me and stuffed them into a bag. He pulled a black box from under the seat and pressed a button on it and set it on the dashboard. "I need you to tell me everything about what happened to you out there, Moon. I need you to start from the night you broke out of Pinson. You want to know how Kit got over the fence and how we got the bus?" "Everything. This is not going to be an easy case to make." "Well, what's that thing?" "It's a tape recorder. You can talk to it and it remembers what you say." "Talk to it?" "Yep, that's right." So I started telling the tape recorder everything I could remember. Mr. Wellington kept his eyes on the highway, and sometimes he would nod and sometimes he'd smile, but he never interrupted me. One time he pulled over to the side of the road and took him to look at a map. "Are you lost?" "Nope, keep talking." When I finally got to the part where he found me on the leash with Sanders, I stopped. Mr. Wellington reached in front of me and pressed another button. "That's quite a story," he said. "Is that going to remember it all for real?" "Oh, it'll remember it." We pulled over next to where the tram road met the blacktop, and Mr. Wellington looked past me and out the window. "This it?" "Yes, sir. About 5 miles or so into those hills." Mr. Wellington got a small backpack out of the truck, put a camera and the rest of the biscuits and 2 water bottles into it. "We've got a good drinking creek at the shelter," I said. He zipped the pack and then put it on. "Just in case," he replied. I shrugged, and the 2 of us started up the tram road. Mr. Wellington didn't walk fast, but he didn't need to stop as much either. Sometimes I'd get too far ahead of him and have to sit down and wait. Only once did he catch up to me and lean against a tree to take a sip of water. He screwed the top of the water bottle back on and wiped his eye with one finger and said, "I can't believe you dragged your friend Kit all this way." "I was scared. You get stronger and quicker when you're scared." "It's adrenaline," he said. "That's what Pap called it. Said if I had enough adrenaline in me, I could whip up on anybody." He put the water bottle back in his pack and walked past me. "I wish you'd stop relying on that advice so much," he said to me. "Come on." It was noon by the time we made it to the shelter. I looked around and saw our fire pit, cold and rain spattered in the center. Several strips of jerky were still hanging on my meat racks. A breeze looked at the treetops and made the place seem quiet and strange. Once again, I felt that the forest had forgotten about me. It seemed distant and untouchable. Mr. Wellington stood for a moment, his hands at his sides, his eyes looking over what Kit and I lived in. Not much room in that thing, he said. Yeah, but it stays warm that way. He shook his head. How many ticks and redbugs did you bring out with you? Everybody sure hates ticks and redbugs. Well, I'm no exception. They don't bother me much. I climbed into the shelter and found the pistol in its hiding place under the marsh grass. I also saw the 2 deerskin hats that we'd made, and I got those as well. When I crawled back out, I gave Mr. Wellington the pistol and put one of the hats on my head. He stared at me as I adjusted it. They're going to convict you for sure with that thing on. Well, I made 'em. I assumed you did, he chuckled, and he looked at the pistol. And this is what you took from Sanders? Yes, sir. He took off the backpack and unzipped it. Then he put the pistol inside and removed one of the water bottles. He straightened up and took 2 large gulps before handing the water over to me. Let's eat those biscuits now, he said. After lunch, Mr. Wellington stood and stuffed the trash into his pockets. Okay, he said, where is this log you shot at? We walked over to where I had shot the pistol at the rotten log, and Mr. Wellington took pictures of it. After he was done, he picked it up and broke off the ends so that he was left with only the middle section that I'd shot. He put this under his arm and tucked the camera away. Now, he said, take me to where you met Sanders. I nodded and set out for the place on Deer Creek where Kit and I had trapped him. I had to keep stopping and waiting for Mr. Wellington to catch up as I ducked my way through the forest. Eventually, we came to the spot. The ground had aged and showed no sign of a struggle, but Mr. Wellington took pictures anyway. So is this where you trapped him? Yes, sir. And you hooked a log up to his feet and then it dragged him into the water down here? That's right. He held on for a while, and that's when I took his pistol. And then he got pulled into the creek and floated away. You're sure that's what happened? Yes, sir. I just find it hard to believe that you could pull off such a stunt. Someone as big as Sanders and all. It doesn't matter how big they are, as long as you get the right trap rigged. Very well, he said. We'll go with what you told me. Mr. Wellington took more pictures and studied the surrounding forest. Finally, he put up his camera and asked me if there was anything else that I'd forgotten to tell him. No, sir. I told you everything. Okay, then. I will see what I can do with all of this. It was late afternoon when we'd made it back to the highway. Mr. Wellington said he would turn me in at the Tuscaloosa County Courthouse so that we wouldn't have Sanders' father for a judge. You think Sanders' pap is just like Sanders? I don't know, and we won't take any chances. I'll drop you off and get these pictures developed and start working on the case. I imagine it won't be long before Sanders finds out where you are and all hell breaks loose. Well, what are you going to do with those pictures? I don't know yet. I've got to see how they come out, and then I will need some time to study them. But I'll think of something. Well, what are you going to try to do for me? Mr. Wellington looked at me and raised his eyebrows. I'm going to try to clear you of attempted murder. I shrugged. All right. It doesn't make a difference to me. Law's going to be after me no matter what. One place is as good as another if you got to be locked away. Well, maybe we can keep you from getting locked away. Well, there's nowhere else for me to go. Mr. Wellington put the cigar back into his mouth and chewed it. We'll just have to see about that, he said. We got to the courthouse right before it closed. The clerk took me from Mr. Wellington and sent me with a policeman to the jail. The policeman put me in the back seat of his car without handcuffs, and after we pulled out of the parking lot, he looked at me in the rearview mirror. You been hiding out in the forest? A little bit. I've kind of been all over. He looked back at the road. Well, what's that on your head? It's a deerskin hat. Where'd you get it? I made it. Oh, yeah? Yeah, and I've got another one right here with the tail still on it, and I held it up for him to see. It's all that I've got left. The policeman looked in the rearview mirror and studied the hat. He shook his head and turned to the road again. You got a fancy lawyer now, huh? Mr. Wellington says he wants to help me, but I don't know what he can do. Well, that constable down in Sumter County says you've been out shooting at him and killing his dogs. Judge Mackin won't cut you slack for that. I'll be glad that lawyer wants to help I'd be glad that lawyer wants to help you out. I just shrugged. You're not going to bite me or nothing, are you? No, sir. I'm not aiming to try to whip up on anybody anymore. I don't aim to bust out of anywhere either. Well, that's good, he nodded to himself. That's real good. I hear you've got a mean bite. I was about to tell him I've only bitten one person in my life, but I didn't. It didn't seem like it would do any good. The Tuscaloosa jail was a lot bigger than the one in Livingston. There were prisoners across from me and on either side. Everybody started asking me questions right after the policeman left the room. Shot any people lately, kid? You speak English? Got any good recipe for dog? What the hell's that thing on your head? I didn't answer any of them. I went to the back of my cage and lay on the cot, and before long, I was asleep to it all. That evening, the policeman who delivered me earlier brought everyone a tray of food. I heard one of the other prisoners call him Officer Pete. We had pork chops and lima beans for supper. Even though it was prison food, I didn't feel like eating anything and picked through the beans with my spoon. When Officer Pete returned, I asked him if he'd heard anything from Mr. Wellington. Oh, nothing, kid. You think he's going to come back? I've never heard of a lawyer turning down a chance to make money. Well, I don't have any money. Well, then you probably won't see him again. Earlier, I thought I didn't care whether he helped me or not, but I was getting lonely in jail. I wanted to see someone who didn't hate me. Well, how about the judge? When's he going to talk to me? Officer Pete shrugged as he picked up the trays from the other prisoners. I don't know anything about what they're going to do to you, kid. They're going to put you in a zoo, somebody yelled. I'd whip up on your little butt, somebody said. Screwed up kid. I figured these prisoners didn't like me since I hadn't talked to them, and I lay back down on my cot and stared at the ceiling. 3 prisoners began playing cards down the hall from me, and another started singing. I wondered what Hal and Kit were doing. I felt like I'd never see either of them again. What are you doing down there, wild boy? I thought about never seeing Mr. Wellington again. You dreaming about dog cobbler? I grew queasy with loneliness, and I rolled onto my side and pulled up my knees. And I laid this way long into the night, taking deep breaths and listening to the other prisoners snoring and tossing in their sleep. Somewhere at the end of the hall, a clock ticked, and I heard the phone ring a couple of times in the office outside. Someone whose voice I didn't recognize answered it. Even though I couldn't have felt any worse where I was, I knew there was no other place for me to go. The next morning, I was on my back staring at the ceiling when the hall door was suddenly kicked in and slammed against the wall. Hey, one of the irritated prisoners yelled. I looked over at the doorway and saw Sanders standing there, his eyes searching each of the jail cages. His face was so swollen with oily poison ivy blisters that he squinted like the sun was in his eyes. His ears, ripped from briars, had orange medicine painted on them that made him look like he wore earmuffs. His hands trembled at his sides. I might not have recognized him had I not been expecting him. Eventually, his eyes came around to my bed and rested on me. He didn't say a word, but walked over to the bars of my cage and stood there. I sat up and stared at him. You got lost out there again, didn't you? I said. I watched his jaw tighten until I was sure his teeth would shatter. Even through the swollen face, I could see veins popping out on his forehead. He swallowed and said calmly, Come here, kid. I want to tell you something. I shook my head. You'll pop me across the face like you did that other fellow. Come here. No. You want me to get the keys and come in there? You go get what you want. Sanders looked around and saw the other prisoners watching him. He spit a brown gob of tobacco juice between the bars of my cage. Damn it, kid, he hissed. I said, get over here. I said, no, you come in here if you want. Sanders clutched the bars tightly. Come here, he yelled. And I shook my head. Hey, one of the prisoners called back. Why don't you keep it down? Are you crazy or what? Sanders pointed at him and spoke through clenched teeth. You best keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you. The prisoner chuckled. Mister, you ain't got no authority in here. You're just a constable. Sanders took a step towards that prisoner's direction. Don't you? Officer Pete came in through the door and looked around. What's going on in here? Sanders stopped, and I saw his sides bulging in and out with heavy breathing. Mr. Sanders, I think it's time for you to leave, Officer Pete said. Yeah? Get out of here, you idiot, someone said. Sanders turned and looked at me. Let me in there with him. I need to discuss some things with that boy. Officer Pete shook his head and grabbed for Sanders' arm. I don't think... Sanders jerked his arm away. Don't handle me, he snarled. Officer Pete straightened and stared at Sanders. Let's go now. Officer Sanders was led away, and the prisoners began asking me questions. Who the hell was that, kid? That was Sanders, I said. Oh, I've seen him on TV, another prisoner said. He's the one that the kid shot at. Ain't that right, kid? I didn't shoot at anybody, I said. In fact, I was getting tired of saying it. He don't act like it. That's because he's always been mad at me. He's just extra mad because he got poison ivy out there. I think that man's gone crazy, the prisoner next to me said. I just shrugged. Well, you're lucky you're in this jail cell. There's nothing lucky about me, I replied. A policeman I didn't know brought me breakfast. I managed to eat some of it and then lay back down to see if I could sleep. By lunchtime, I was still staring at the ceiling. I was so tired that I felt sick, but sleep wouldn't come. When the new policeman brought lunch, I didn't get up for it. I let it lie on the floor until he came and picked it up again. Officer Pete brought supper around 5, and I asked him again if he'd heard anything about what they were going to do to me. He got irritated with me as he moved to the next cage. Look, kid, I told you, I don't know anything. I'm not the news service for prisoners. But I've been here since yesterday. Yeah, and you've been a pain in the butt, too. We about had to handcuff that crazy fellow from Sumter County. But Mr. Wellington said he was going to help me. He turned and looked at me. Well, consider yourself lucky. Some of these people have been in here a month. I lay back down on my cot. Officer Pete came back. Are you going to eat anything? He ain't had nothing all day except a bite or two of breakfast, somebody said. That's because I'm not hungry. Officer Pete picked up the supper tray and shrugged. Suit yourself. Chapter 43. That night, I dreamed of being holed up by myself in the old shelter where I lived with Pat. Bigfoots came out of the forest and tore at the walls, and I sat on the hide pile and clutched my rifle, even though I knew it wouldn't do any good against something as large as Bigfoot. Eventually, I crawled into the stage 2 box through the muddy hole at the back of the shelter. I heard the Bigfoots digging at the ground, and before long, they were banging on the top of the box with their fists and scratching the door with their fingernails. I felt them rolling it out of the ground like a piece of culvert pipe and working themselves into a howling frenzy. Then suddenly, I couldn't hear them anymore, and I saw the doorknob to the little steel door at the end of the pipe begin to jiggle. I waited while my heart thumped loudly in my chest. When I woke, Officer Pete was opening the door to my cage. Let's go, kid. I sat up and looked about, getting my bearings. I rubbed my eyes while he waited with hands on his hips. Let's go, he said again. I don't have all day. I put on my hat and grabbed Kit's. You gonna put some handcuffs on me? I asked. We don't put handcuffs on kids, he said. You're no threat to me. I followed him into the office, and as we approached the outside door, he turned to me. Stay close and don't stop to answer any questions. Just get in the car. I didn't know why he told me that, but I got up next to him, and when he opened the door, I understood what he was talking about. Cameras were flashing and people were everywhere. Hey, Moon, they shouted at me. Say something for us, Moon. Who's your lawyer? Alabama Moon? We hear you've got a lawyer. Why'd you turn yourself in? I grabbed Officer Pete's belt loop and he pulled me along to the squad car. He opened the back door and I jumped in. I sat up on the seat and watched the people gathering around, the flash bulbs going off near the window. Wave for me, Moon. Bury your teeth for us. I looked at Officer Pete in the rearview mirror as he pulled away from the crowd. He glanced back at me and shook his head. You're a real pain in the ass. You know that? I didn't do anything to those people out there. Yeah, for somebody that hasn't ever done anything, you sure have a bunch of people stirred up. Are we going to go see that judge? That's right. That's what you wanted, isn't it? I was just wondering. I'd been more than just wondering if I were you. He's pretty ticked off over all of this. He wants to know just what he's going to do with a 10-year-old who shot at a law enforcement officer. I told you. I know what you said, but you've got a half-crazed constable from Sumter County that says he'll swear on the Bible otherwise. Yeah, well, he'd be lying. Why would he lie about something like that? I shrugged. I don't know. Officer Pete shook his head. I don't know either, kid. Officer Pete took me into the courthouse through the back entrance where there weren't any reporters. He put me into another cage and left me alone. I sat there for an hour before he came back again. All right, he said, Judge Mackin's ready for you. He said if you're going to act crazy on him, he's going to put you in a straitjacket. What's that? Something you won't like. Now come on. When I walked into the courtroom, the first person I saw was Sanders. He sat in the front row and stared at me with a swollen face. He wore no expression and seemed to look right through me. My heart started beating faster when I saw Mr. Wellington in front on the other side of the courtroom. He was dressed in a three-piece suit, and his hair was slicked back behind a face that was scrubbed shiny. Except for a guard at the entrance, the only other person in the room was Judge Mackin. He sat behind his desk on the raised platform in the front of the room with one elbow on the desk and his cheek pressed into his palm. He had white curly hair, a pink face, and droopy eyes that reminded me of a wild hog. Glasses sat perched at the end of his nose, and I heard him breathing heavily. When he spoke, he sounded tired. What's that on his head, Officer Pete? It's his squirrel hat, Your Honor. Well, get him to take it off, the judge mumbled. Yes, Your Honor. You know better than that. I don't care how old he is. Take off the hat, Moon. I took it off and put it under my arm with Kit's hat. The judge moved his eyes to watch me, and I followed behind Officer Pete over to where Mr. Wellington stood. Why does he have two? The judge asked. It's all I've got left, I replied. The judge squinted at me. Was I talking to you? No, sir. Then stay quiet until somebody asks you a question. Yes, sir. Officer Pete dropped me off next to Mr. Wellington, and I felt proud to have him on my side. I smiled up at him. I thought you'd left me, I said. Mr. Wellington put his finger to his lips and motioned for me to watch the judge. I felt him pull my hat from beneath my arm and saw him set them on the table in front of us. I looked at the judge and then over at Sanders. His eyes danced like the inside of his head was on fire. Now, Judge Mackin said as he removed his glasses and began to clean them with a handkerchief, we've got an unusual situation here, and because of that, I'm closing this hearing to the public. Another reason for that is I've got a bad headache, and all of those people out there are driving me crazy. He set his glasses on the desk. Moon Blake, he said, you've stirred up quite a commotion out there. I don't like commotion. I don't like people who shoot at law enforcement officers, and I don't like people who eat other people's dogs. Sanders is a liar, I said. Hey, the judge snapped. Did I ask you a question? I looked at Mr. Wellington. He put his finger to his lips again. The judge licked his mouth and turned to Sanders. Okay, then, let's get started. Mr. Sanders, why don't you come up here and give your side of the story? I'm a constable, Your Honor. Whatever, just get up here. Sanders acted like he was about to say something, but twisted his mouth around and stood up. He walked to the front of the room and stood before the judge. The judge winced and shook his head slowly. What'd you get into? Poison ivy, he said. The judge jerked his head up and pointed his finger at me as his eyes grew wide. Mr. Wellington bent over and whispered in my ear, Moon, you can't speak in here unless you get permission. The judge continued to watch me as he held a book sideways towards Sanders. You're not going to tell a lie, are you? Sanders put his hand on the book and then shook his head. No, he said. Good, the judge replied, and he put the book on his desk. Go on then. Sanders took a deep breath and sat down. I'm going to tell this one more time. You'll tell it as many times as I want you to tell it. Just because your daddy's a small-time judge over there in Sumter County doesn't mean you're going to get any special treatment here. And I saw the veins on Sanders' forehead stand up as he clenched his teeth. He stared at the back of the room, at some place on the wall behind us. And after a second, his veins relaxed, and he continued. This boy is the son of an outlaw. Mr. Wellington stood up. Irrelevant, Your Honor. The judge sighed. Mr. Sanders, it seems we've got a fancy big city lawyer to deal with today. And he's right. Sustained. Did this boy attempt to shoot you or not? He did. With what? A pistol. Well, what kind? A .45. And where did he get it? He stole it from me. The judge leaned back in his chair and he watched Sanders. He stole it from you? Sanders' veins rose up again and relaxed. Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked at me. I nodded to him, and his eyes grew wide. Are you agreeing that you stole it from him or that you shot at him? I stole it from him, I said, but I never shot anybody. He turned back to Sanders. Well, the kid admits that he stole your gun. How'd you let that happen? I leaned forward, but Mr. Wellington pulled me back. I saw Sanders kneading his hands together. He was still staring at someplace on the rear wall. I was asleep, he said. He's lying, I whispered to Mr. Wellington, and the judge cocked his eyes at me. It's all right, Mr. Wellington said quietly. We can tell the judge when it's our turn to talk. The judge continued to watch me out of the corner of his eyes while he talked to Sanders. So, he got your gun while you were asleep? What next? He just backed up and pointed it at me and shot at my stomach and missed. And then he turned and ran off. And took your pistol with him? That's right. Judge Mackin wrote something down. After a second, he said, okay, tell me about the dogs. I sent 3 tracking dogs after him and the 2 other boys that broke out of Pinson Boys' home. I heard the dogs yelping. Later on, I found their carcasses hanging from a tree. Guts laying everywhere, meat clean to the bone. And you say the boy bit you too? Yes, sir, he did. What else? That's it. The judge sat back in his chair and looked at Mr. Wellington. Okay, lawyer, your turn. Mr. Wellington stood calmly and made his way to the front of the courtroom. He faced Sanders. Mr. Sanders, where were you when Moon supposedly shot at you with your pistol? Sanders looked straight into Mr. Wellington's eyes. I was in the Talladega National Forest. Describe your surroundings. I don't remember. You mean you were lost out in the forest and then shot at, and you don't remember anything about your surroundings? Who said I was lost? Just an assumption. Perhaps I'm wrong. Listen here, you slick old son of a... The judge slammed his gavel down on the desk without lifting his cheek from his palm. I jumped in my chair from surprise. Sanders paused for a moment and then spoke calmly. I was near a creek, I think. You think? Yeah, I was beside a creek. And Moon Blake shot at you once? That's right. Just once? That's right. And how far away was he when he shot at you? About 10 yards, I guess. Pretty close. And you saw the remains of your dog? Not far from there? That's right. I see, Mr. Wellington said. Can I remind you, Mr. Sanders, that you're under... He knows he's under oath, Mr. Wellington, the judge said warily. Stop fancy pantsing around in here and get on with it. Sanders looked over at the judge. Your Honor, I thought this was going to be an informal hearing. How come I got this lawyer in my face? I can't keep the boy from having his own counsel, Mr. Sanders. Sanders shook his head and looked back at Mr. Wellington. Well, ask what you got to ask, Slick. Mr. Wellington nodded politely. You say you saw the carcasses of your dogs not far from where the shooting took place? That's right. Are you sure it wasn't a single deer carcass that Moon had left not far from there? You don't think I know a deer carcass from a dog carcass? And I said there were 3. Very well, said Mr. Wellington. He walked to the table where I sat. He reached beside me and pulled a plastic bag from his briefcase. Inside the bag was Sanders' pistol. He held it up. Is this your pistol, Sanders? Sanders' forehead's veins popped up again and his eyes grew wide. He stood and held out his hands for it. Mr. Wellington walked over to him and held it in front of him, just out of reach. Well, Sanders said, let me see that thing. You can see it just fine, the judge said. Sit down. Yep, it looks like mine. Give me that. Mr. Wellington swung the pistol away and laid it on the judge's desk. The judge stared at it for a second and then looked at Mr. Wellington. Go on. That's my pistol he stole, Sanders said as he reached for it. Get your hands away from my desk, the judge snapped. I said sit down. Sanders clenched his teeth, sat and stared at the back wall. Mr. Wellington waited a few seconds and then continued. Mr. Sanders? What? Did you shoot that pistol at all that day before Moon supposedly took it from you and fired at you? No. And he only fired at you once? That's what I said. How many shells does that pistol hold? 9 in the clip and 1 in the chamber. Mr. Wellington turned to the judge. Your Honor, if you examine the clip, you'll see that there are 8 bullets in it. The bullets are oxidized against the clip, evidence that they've been in there and positioned in such a way for some time and have not been tampered with. Sanders smiled and shook his head. Maybe he shot it again, Slick. Mr. Wellington nodded. Yes, he did. Moon shot that pistol twice. Sanders shrugged his shoulders and looked at the judge. Can I go, Your Honor? The judge looked at Mr. Wellington. The lawyer held up his finger and walked it to the briefcase. He pulled out some pictures and another small plastic bag with 2 bullets in it. He took these to the judge and set them on his desk. Again, the judge looked down at them and eyed them. What is all that? It's a picture of a log with 2 bullets in it. In that bag are the only 2 bullets that were shot out of that pistol. As you know, there are tests that can prove the bore markings on those bullets match Mr. Sanders' pistol. If you examine the pictures and the others I've taken of the log, and even I have the log itself if it becomes necessary, you'll see these bullets are the same ones that were embedded in the log. Sanders stood up. So maybe he fired twice at me. Hell, what are you getting when you're getting shot at? You lose track of things. This time the judge lifted his cheek from his palm and stared at Sanders. If I have to tell you to sit down one more time, I'm going to throw some rope around you and that chair. Sanders sat with his hands shaking on top of the armrests. Mr. Wellington turned to me and winked. Moon, he said, how is it that we know this log was nowhere near Mr. Sanders in the creek? All of a sudden, I knew what he was doing. The answer to his question shot into my head and seemed like it was ringing a bell inside me. Because there aren't any pine logs by creeks. They're all up at the top of the hill. Sanders started to get up, but sat down again and leaned forward in his seat. That's the craziest damned... Hey, the judge said. Craziest damned offense, Sanders mumbled, and the judge shot him a look, and Sanders settled into his chair. Mr. Wellington turned and began walking towards our table. When his back was to the judge, he looked up at me and smiled. Mr. Wellington sat down. The courtroom was quiet, and everyone watched the judge. He rubbed his temples and stared at the top of his desk. I'm not sure what's being accomplished here, he said to the desk. Bullets in a log, bore markings, inconsistencies in the number of shots. This is pretty shaky, Wellington. Maybe that log rolled down the hill. Maybe it washed up on the creek bank. Mr. Wellington nodded. I thought of that, Your Honor. And with your permission, I'd like to make a few more points. The judge looked up and sighed. Good. That would be helpful. I'd like to introduce my second piece of evidence. My client here, Moon Blake. Bring him up then. Actually, with your permission, I'd like to demonstrate something outside the courtroom. I believe your police department has a shooting range not far outside of town. I'd like to go there for my demonstration. Sanders twisted in his chair and threw up his hands. The judge stared at Mr. Wellington for what seemed like a long time. And then finally he said, Wellington, I think this is going to be a waste of my time. You and your fancy talk may work with the jury, but I can cut it down to what it is. You're not in a big city anymore. However, this is your lucky day. I don't feel good at all. You give me a nap and I'll take your country drive with you. He tapped the gavel on his desk. Reconvene in 2 hours. Meet me in the garage so we don't start a parade with all those reporters out there. All right, guys. Just 1 second. I promised you 10 minutes.